US President Donald Trump's sweeping new trade tariffs on more than 90 countries around the world have come into effect.
US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin are set to meet in coming days as the US ramps up pressure on Putin to end Russia's war in Ukraine.
Authorities in the UK detained first migrants under the plan to thwart boats crossing through the English Channel from France.
The world experienced its third warmest July on record this year, according to the European Union agency that tracks global warming.
The US began officially levying higher taxes on imports from dozens of countries on Thursday, 4 months after President Donald Trump first announced plans to impose tariffs on most of the world. The White House said that starting just after midnight, goods from more than 60 countries would face tariff rates of 10% or higher. Products from the European Union, Japan, and South Korea will be taxed at 15%, while imports from Taiwan, Vietnam, and Bangladesh will be taxed at 20%. While seeking new trade agreements across the board, the Trump administration says it expects places such as the EU, Japan, and South Korea to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in the US. Trump's trade policies are aimed at reshaping the structure of global trade, which he believes is unfair towards the US. Despite the controversy, the US has remained confident that the onset of its broad tariffs will provide clarity about the path of the world's largest economy. In late July, the EU and US tentatively agreed on a 15% tariff for the vast majority of EU products. The deal is, however, preliminary and its details are yet to be fleshed out.
US President Donald Trump has hit India with an extra 25% tariff over its Russian oil deals, bringing total US tariffs on the country to a steep 50%. India has not supported Ukraine-related sanctions by the US and its allies on Moscow by continuing to acquire oil from Russia. The tariffs are set to take effect 21 days after the order is signed. The move is ostensibly aimed at cutting the Kremlin off from revenue to fund its ongoing war in Ukraine and pushing Moscow towards the negotiating table.
US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin are preparing to meet, a Kremlin aide said Thursday, confirming previous reports. A meeting could take place as soon as next week. The announcement comes after Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff visited Moscow, and one day before a deadline imposed by Trump for Putin to agree to a ceasefire deal is set to expire. Neither side confirmed what Witkoff's visit to Moscow entailed, with Trump refusing to call the meeting a breakthrough. Trump has previously expressed frustration with the Russian leader's inability to agree to even a temporary pause in fighting, with Russia continuing to strike Ukrainian towns and cities despite US efforts to seal a truce. Trump hinted at plans to hold a three-way meeting between himself, Putin, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, a proposal the Kremlin played down. Moscow left the option of that meeting without comment, the Kremlin said Thursday. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that Russia was more inclined to agree to a truce following Witkoff's visit. He cautioned that it is important that Russia does not deceive Ukraine or the United States in the details of a potential ceasefire agreement. Russian strikes have killed at least 6 people and injured 35 others across Ukraine in the past day, just one day before US President Donald Trump's deadline for Moscow to agree to a ceasefire deal. The attacks killed 4 civilians in the Zaporizhzhia region, its governor said, where Moscow launched a total of 723 strikes on at least 12 areas in the past day. Another 2 civilians were killed in the wider Donetsk area, with additional injuries in Sumy, Kharkiv, and Kherson. The strikes come just one day before a deadline imposed by Trump for Russia to halt fighting on Ukraine or face a wave of sweeping additional tariffs. On Wednesday, Trump appeared to implement his threats by hitting India with an additional 25% tariff over its purchases of Russian oil. The US leader has said he will up the economic pressure on Russia should it continue to strike Ukraine past the ceasefire deadline date.
British border authorities have detained the first group of migrants under a pilot plan that will send some who crossed the English Channel on small boats back to France. According to the UK Home Office, the migrants were detained on Wednesday, the day the program came into force, and will be held at immigration removal centres until they are returned to France.
The groundbreaking principle here is that people can be returned to France if they arrive on these dangerous and illegal small boats. In return, we will take people who have applied legally through a legal process, been through security checks, but we should be returning people who have made these illegal crossings.
UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron announced a deal last month. While the pilot involves a limited number of people, UK officials suggest the deal is a breakthrough because it sets a precedent. However, critics say the program will do little to deter migrants because the numbers returned to France are small and loopholes will allow people who enter Britain illegally to remain as they pursue human rights claims.
Double standards in the EU's application of international law towards Ukraine and Gaza are eroding Europe's credibility with the global south. This is what the former EU ambassador to the Palestinian-occupied territories and the Gaza Strip, Sven von Burgstoff, told Euronews in an interview. The ex-EU envoy said that the bloc is eager to strike trade deals with countries from the global south. But Europe's stance on Israel is undermining its credibility and making it harder to be taken seriously. For instance, there is a noticeable lack of strong support from the most global South countries for Europe's efforts against Russia.
Two countries, the Bahamas and Micronesia. These are the powerhouse of the global South supporting us in our just and legitimate fight against Russia. Meaning, people don't take the EU and the member states seriously when we pledge to actually support human rights and defend international law. If we want to regain our own moral credibility and legitimacy, we need to act against what we're seeing every day in Gaza. Unless we do that, we are losing our partnerships and our credibility across the world.
Von Burgstoff served as EU ambassador between January 2020 and July 2023. He was recently a coordinator of a letter sent by 58 former EU ambassadors to heads of governments and EU institutions, calling for actions against Israel due to the ongoing situations in Gaza and in the West Bank. They outlined some recommendations on how the EU can put pressure on Israel.
We can act with what we call qualified majority, where at least 15 member states, representing about 2/3 of the European population, can actually decide on a matter of commercial policy to take action. And here we suggest that, for instance, we end or suspend all preferential trade arrangements with Israel. We also suggest and propose that all trade with the illegal settlements in Israel, meaning in the occupied Palestinian territory, is being stopped.
The world experienced its third warmest July on record this year, according to the European Union agency that tracks global warming. Despite a slightly lower global average temperature, scientists at the EU Copernicus Climate Change Service said heat and deadly floods persisted in July. Hot weather and dry conditions following an unusually dry and warm spring fueled fires across southern Europe last month. Northern European countries also felt the heat, with Finland and Norway suffering from heat waves and record temperatures. While not as hot as July 2023 or 2024, the hottest and second hottest on record, they warned that this does not mean climate change has stopped. According to the monitoring agency, new temperature records and more climate extremes are to be expected unless greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere are brought down. Greenhouse gases released from the burning of fossil fuels like gasoline, oil and coal are the main cause of climate change.
A majority of EU countries are proposing changes to simplify the EU's deforestation law, a legislation approved in 2023 which aims at reducing the EU's impact on global deforestation. But the NGO Earthsight has warned that these changes could facilitate illegal exports of timber from Russia and Belarus. In an interview with euronews, Tara Ganesh, a timber expert at Earthsight, said that the simplification measures would create more opportunities for fraud. Lighter rules could be applied to certain third countries, potentially resulting in fewer inspections and no mandatory geolocalization requirements.
Well, that's where the EU deforestation regulation would really, close the circle in terms of the existing EU legislation and make it a requirement across the board for companies to not just know where their wood is coming from, because the EUTR to some extent already requires that, but to show geolocation coordinates, for example, for where the wood in their products, comes from, which is a very, very powerful tool because, that can be used to debunk fake harvest claims, fake origin claims.
The expert said that 8 of the countries pushing for these amendments are, incidentally, benefiting significantly from the illegal timber trade. According to the NGO, Bulgaria, Croatia, Czechia, Estonia, Italy, Poland, Portugal and Slovenia account for 67% of the revenue generated from the fraudulent activity since the sanction came into force.
Incidentally, a lot of the member states that were calling for the no-risk proposal were also some of the member states that were getting some of the highest volumes of, conflict plywood.
Russian and Belarusian timber has been under EU sanctions since July 2022, following the start of the war in Ukraine in February that year.